My name is Jon Burmeister, and I'm in the Perspectives program here at BC. Before I introduce our first speaker, I wanted to say just a few words about the genesis of the idea for this event. For the past 2 years, I've taught a course in the philosophy department in the summers here. It's called The Meaning of Work and Leisure. And as I've been thinking about these topics, I've been thinking about them along with my students, both looking back to the past and also looking ahead to the future. So we have we read Aristotle, we read Seneca, Adam Smith, Max Weber, to get a sense of what great thinkers in the tradition have had to say about work and about leisure. And we also look toward the future we look a little bit at machine learning and what machine learning has to do with the future of work, different kinds of artificial intelligence. And we also look at things like virtual reality and what this might have to do with the future of leisure in terms of these extremely seductive technologies that could potentially suck away a lot of our free time. And as I've been thinking more about this, I've become more and more convinced that a couple of different 21st century social forces, technological and otherwise, pose some pretty serious challenges to leading healthy lives of work and healthy lives of leisure. I've also become more and more convinced that a genuine liberal arts education has to be a central pillar to our collective response to these challenges. Challenges to healthy work, challenges to healthy leisure. And that's why I brought these fine scholars here today to think through with us, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion as well, about how we can respond to these kinds of challenges with the help of these various disciplines, whether it's finance, global affairs, philosophy, political science, literature, history. So before I introduce the first speaker, just a few words of thanks. This conference was funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, sponsored by the BC Philosophy Department. I'd like to send particular thanks to Arthur Madigan and Gary Gertler for making this possible. Thanks to you all for coming, and if you have phones, if you could silence those, that would be great. Our first speaker is Peter Marber. Peter is an award-winning money manager and expert in global finance, having worked for some of the world's largest financial institutions. To give just one example, he headed emerging market investments for HSBC Global Asset Management. Peter's been a market commentator for CNN, the Financial Times, CNBC, the Wall Street Journal, and many others. He has taught at Harvard and Columbia, and he currently directs the Global Economy program at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. He's also a senior lecturer at Jon Hopkins Carey Business School. Peter has published 6 books, including one very relevant to this conference, entitled The Evolution of Liberal Arts in the Global Age. Please join me in welcoming Peter to Boston College.
So interesting that the philosopher's wearing the Wall Street suit. And I wanted to, as I was in the philosophy department, I put the jacket on and I had the patches. Trying to be as professorial as I could. So this is sort of an interesting conference, and I have written on little bits of a lot of the topics you're going to hear about today. And I wanted to call this discussion Liberal Arts and Work Amid the Third Technological Revolution. We'll talk about what the Third Technological Revolution is. And the subtitle is The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and the Beautiful. And the beautiful is really something I do want to emphasize, because I think a lot of young people, I have kids not that different in age than you, they're 23 and 25, and they're just daunted by the future, reading about AI and robots, and wonder if there actually is going to be work for them as they get out into the world. And of course there's going to be work, but there's going to be so much more than that. And that's what I want to talk about, things I think you can be excited about. One of the things I try to emphasize with my students all the time when talking about these type of really big issues is really trying to understand the broad trend line and not the headline, right? It's just very easy for us to get caught up in the day. But I want us to discuss this topic in really more of a historical context, because what we're going to talk about really is sort of the story of our species. It's not the story of the day. This is really a kind of a great story of what's happened to Homo sapiens over a very short period of time, when things have gotten just much better than we probably think. And I remember sort of reading about this as a teenager, and the title that, for this presentation comes from Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave. And Toffler talked about three big technological revolutions. The first one was sort of the agrarian revolution, the agricultural revolution, which replaced hunter and gatherer lifestyles right around 900 CE, and it truly altered patterns of life and work. We used to just sort of roam the planet, but this is where we started building civilization. The second wave is the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure you've covered a lot of that in many different classes. The idea of mass production, consumption, mass education, media, leisure, entertainment, where we have people replaced by machines, and we see this dramatic output, difference in output, just dramatic changes to what people had seen for millennia. And the third wave that Toffler talks about came around in the 70s, really with the beginning of computing, but it's still kind of continuing now as we sort of look at the future, where we're bolting very, very sophisticated computers with machines, robots, creating really a very different pattern for work that we could think of in the future. And the questions everybody asks is this just going to replace all of us? We're just going to have these smart robots doing all the work for us. And you know, the interesting thing is that people have been worrying about machines replacing them for decades, or really centuries. I mean, if we go back to the 1470s, when the printing press was first introduced, I mean, we had loads of protests by engravers in Germany who also worried about losing their job and what was the future going to be for them. I mean, this is not anything new. During the Industrial Revolution, this is Mr. Ludd of the Luddites, right? During the 19th century, in the Industrial Revolution, right, we had people rising up when machinery began to replace human work, particularly in the textile and the weaving space. I say weaving. And you had protests all around the world. And you know, the Luddites actually went and like bombed machines and blew them up, right? And quite violent protests. And we've also had protests not just about machines replacing people, but how about other people replacing people? Immigration has been an issue, particularly in America. We've been worrying about immigration's impact on work for a very long time. We forget that in the 19th century, about 35 million people immigrated to the US. People worried a lot, particularly in the 1870 to 1910. It helped expand our labor force by about a third, but of course there were loads of people protesting and worrying about where were all the jobs going to go. Were they going to go to all these immigrants who would be willing to work cheap? It's not that different today, right? We hear very similar concerns. But I think there's a bigger story. There really is some good news here. And if we, again, think of it as the story of Homo sapiens and where we've come from, there really is great news out there. I mean, I'm sure you've read a lot of this in other classes, but by all measures, violent crime all around the world, it's sort of the safest time to be a human being like ever in the history of the planet. Poverty is down to a record low. We forget that about 200 years ago, pretty much everybody lived in poverty. Poverty right now, defined as maybe $2 a day, is kind of down to about 10 or 15%. That's a big difference than 98%, let's say 200 years ago, right? And we have billions more people living on the planet. So it's amazing that we are doing as well as we are. And if you look at all types of health trends, for example, just in the last 50 years alone, life expectancy has grown almost 9 years. I mean, folks, it used to take hundreds and thousands of years for us to get that kind of improvement in life expectancy, and we're getting it actually in very short periods. Human life expectancy now is greater than it ever has been. But when you look at people and how they feel, this 2017 survey question, is life better today than 50 years ago? What was the answer? Well, in the US, only 37% say better, 41% say worse. And of course, like all the data would suggest exactly the opposite. Really, life has never really been better than ever before. It just doesn't sort of feel that way. And the funny thing is, when you think about our story as humans, the progress we've made is relatively a new story. You know, humans have been roaming the planet for 200,000 years. And it's only like in the last 200 years that we've figured out some kind of formula to live better. It's a remarkable story. And even back in 1930, Keynes was probably the first to observe, who noticed that, you know, that, I'll just read part of this, there was no great change in the standard life of the average man living in civilized centers of the earth up until about the 18th century. Visitation of plague, famine, and war, golden intervals, but no progressive, violent change. The slow rate of progress or lack of progress was due to two reasons: to the remarkable absence of technical improvements and to the failure of capital to accumulate. Technology, I think we all understand, is central to this story. Technology creates what economists like to call the economic surplus, the excess. You know, we forget it used to take 19 humans to feed 20 humans, right? We really had very little excess. But now I think we could have one farmer could feed something like 500 people just driving around on a combine. It's kind of amazing how much excess we produce, more than what we need to survive. But this has only been in the last couple hundred years. In fact, if you look throughout history, you see this? Really, the chart here is looking from about 2000 BCE to 2000. And you'll see that sort of spike up on the right. That's GDP per capita. We forget that global output only grew by maybe 0.1, 0.2% a year for millennia. At that rate, it takes output like 500 to 1,000 years to actually double. It's remarkable. Anybody know how fast China has been growing for the last 30-odd years? On average, it's about 10%. Now it's down to less than 7, but you know, a 10% growth rate, you're doubling output every 7-odd years. You're quadrupling it in less than 15. Folks, this is just miraculous by any, you know, piece of evidence that we have. And that's why you can see this huge spike not only in GDP, but notice we see life expectancy, which was only around 25 years at the time of zero. And by the 20th century, it had extended out to 67 years. I should keep in mind that in the 1800s, it was only around 40 years. So it's kind of amazing that we've been able to press out life expectancy literally by decades in just a few generations. And of course, technology is a big piece of this. You can see that almost everything that's really propelled us as humans in terms of technology has only been introduced to the world just in the last couple hundred years. It's quite amazing. And of course, so much more just in the last 50 years. And you can kind of see that there's been this change in the global economy. If we look back at 1820, just before the Industrial Revolution, and we think about productivity gains, keep in mind that back in 1820, productivity around the world is roughly the same everywhere, right? Everybody's pretty much a farmer, and a farmer in old Peking or old Constantinople or England, probably not that different productivity-wise. So the output of a country was largely productivity times the number of people. So which two countries have the most output? India and China. Did they have the most population? Yeah, they had like half the world's population and half the world's output. But you can see that the Industrial Revolution, which started really in the UK and then the US and West Europe, you can see that just 50 years into it, look at these two little upstart countries, the UK and US, already producing like 18% of the world's output with just a fraction of the world's population. And this story is continuing into the 20th century, where we're starting to see this great economic catch-up with productivity in all these other countries that just started maybe a century or so later. But they're all kind of catching up. And you can see that the technological progress, this is a chart showing human height. There's a big correlation between wealth, health, and human development. And you can see, for example, human height jumping dramatically with health from around 1820 forward. And I don't know if you can see all the different countries. This is a kind of a busy chart. But you can see this is Japan. And there's a jump of about, I think, something like 10 or 15 centimeters in height from 1880 to 1980. You can see that it's just lagging because we had similar things happening in the US, in Europe, like a century earlier. And I think if you look at other countries, India hasn't even begun this curve, but it will start soon. and we'll probably see very similar patterns in many emerging markets. And also, we've had a decline in poverty. As I mentioned, you see it mostly first in Europe, but it's also beginning in some of the other developing countries. China has seen a massive reduction in poverty, and we believe this will just continue. But the story is more than just about productivity. It really does go to leisure, and we'll talk about that, because for most of human history, we've just woken up, went out to the farm, toiled, went home, ate a little, went to sleep, and did that for like 30 or 40 years, and then probably died. Nothing more, nothing less. That was pretty much human existence. And keep in mind that even in 1880, after the Industrial Revolution started, we were probably spending about 80% of our discretionary time over our life working, with only about 20% leisure. But by 1995, if you look in the US, we had flipped this dramatically. First of all, we'd extended life expectancy by many years. And you can see that not only did our discretionary time increase, but look at that flip of work and labor. Does everybody see that? So instead of working 80% and leisure 20%, we flipped it already to 40% work and 60% leisure. That is just, again, a kind of a miraculous story that happened in a relatively short period of time. And this story is going to continue. I've got some data to show you later. And as industries shift and change, notice that our jobs are going to shift and change. We forget that back in, this is looking at the stock market in 1900 versus 2017, and the stock market is a good representation of the dominant sectors and industries of its time. And of course, in 1900, look at the railroad. I mean, railroad were the tech stocks of its day. And you can see that we had rail, we have iron, coal, and steel, tobacco, telegraph, a little bit of banks. But actually today, we have industries that we could not have dreamt of 100 years ago, right? And of course, do we have mass unemployment during this transition from like the railroad age to the tech age? Not really. Humans kind of evolve. You develop different skills, new industries erupt, others die or shift and move to other countries. And just keep this in mind, because this pattern is probably just going to continue for most of our lifetimes. And the thing that I want to bring back to this slide and remind everybody is, so China and India were kind of left in the dust by the middle of the 20th century. You see, China had dropped down to only 5% of the world's output, even though they probably had more than 15% of the world's population back in 1950. And does everybody see where we're going to be going towards 2050? These countries, their productivity is going to be roughly equivalent of where ours is in advanced economies, and they're going to have roughly the share of output that they had just before the Industrial Revolution, as their productivity gaps catch up. And just keep that in mind, because that's another big force that we're contending with, is that a lot of jobs that we were doing, that we sort of had the productive capabilities and advantages, have now sort of shifted. Productivity there are a lot of productive people all over the world. And we're just going to have to get used to the fact that certain sectors and jobs are going to shift around. And part of that you can see, again, and this is part of the good news, is because productivity is increasing around the world as health and well-being has been increasing and spreading around the world. The Human Development Index looks at health, education, and incomes. And you can see very high income countries in 1960 had a huge advantage over middle income and low income countries. So you can kind of think of very high income countries as the US and Western Europe, and middle income and low income countries as sort of emerging markets in Latin America and Asia. And what you see by 1993 is, yes, high income countries moved up close to 0.8, and I should mention 1 would be the perfect score. So as you get higher, we're getting healthier, smarter, and having higher incomes. And you'll see that middle income, though, has made huge progress and really closed the gaps. And even the lowest income groups have dramatically closed gaps in just 2 generations. And this is just going to kind of continue as we go forward. It's a good story. People are living longer, they're better fed, they're more literate, they're more participatory in the global economy. And it's not stuff that we should really lament. It's actually a great story. a story of human triumph in some respects. And how many people have seen this elephant curve or heard about this? So this shows us a recent period between 1980 and 2008 about the cutting the world from 0 to 100 in terms of percentile of global income distribution. So this is the poorest and that's the richest. And this is the income growth that we saw in percent during that period. And you'll notice that pretty much below, let's say 80%, almost every income group around the world, most of the poorest groups actually rose the most. We do see a little bit of that trunk, right? That's the 1% around the world. So the top 5 to 1% also did remarkably well. And this is really one of the great stories that happened in just a very short period of time. Billions of people saw huge increases in their incomes. That's why that HDI number has gone up so fast. But if I examine that a little bit, what we're seeing is it doesn't affect everybody equally. Sure, there are billions in this middle that have done better, but actually the poorest have been sort of locked out. And of course, the richest have done extremely well. You see that we also have this little group over here that actually is kind of lost ground. Everybody see that? Sort of in the, roughly the 80th percentile. Does anybody want to take a guess as who was like the 80th percentile in the world in terms of income? Anybody know where that would probably be? How about like America, Europe, Japan, sort of the global middle class, the folks who are protesting about all the jobs that are sort of either being roboted away or immigrated away or outsourced. And that's the bad news. The bad news is this chart, which is there are some people who have been losing. And this is about 10% of the world's population, which is, we have about 7 billion people. This is sort of the 700 million people in Europe, the US, parts of Japan, Australia, middle income, global middle class people who haven't benefited that much from the last 20 or 30 years of globalization, where it's really helped the bottom income folks in the world the most, and also certainly the 1% has prospered a lot during this period too. And this is part of the bad news. We might think it is bad news, but notice that there's been this big change in who's dominating the global economy. So back in 1990, 64% of the world's output was really coming from those middle-class countries, those high-income countries, including the US, Canada, Western Europe, and Japan. And at that time, we had less than 37% coming from emerging markets. But does everybody see that by 2018, this has flipped to the point now we have almost 60% is coming out of these countries, and we're down to around 40% in the wealthier countries. And so we now have a much more competitive global economy. It's, in a lot of ways, it's a lot better, but it is indeed more competitive. And one of the results of this competition is that employment in manufacturing, and this is looking at US manufacturing employment, which was hovering at around 18 million people from 1970 to around 2000. But with NAFTA in 94 and China joining the WTO in 2001, notice that we start seeing a decrease in the number of manufacturing jobs in the US. So everybody see we've probably lost something in the order of about 6 million jobs. Anybody know how many people are in the US workforce? We have about 140 million. So 6 million is a lot. Think about how many percentage points, right? That's 4+ percentage points. And that's a big, big change. Now the funny thing is, even though we have less people employed in manufacturing, does everybody see that actually manufacturing is bigger than it had been, and it has been in a really long time? We've had actually a 20% jump in our productive output, and yet we're doing it with a lot less people. That's also part of this story, right? It's not just competition from abroad, but also we're using automation, we're using computers, we're using robots to help boost our productivity. So we can manufacture now with a lot less human input. So who has actually been doing well in the US during this big transition? Everybody see this? This is looking at unemployment rates depending on what your education level is. And fortunately, everybody in this room is in pretty good shape, actually. Because if you look at the unemployment rate, it really starts, the lowest level is high school or less than high school. You'll see that that's really where the rates start to jump up. But if you have a doctorate or a master's or even a bachelor's, we have less than 3% unemployment in that space. And you can see actually that your incomes are dramatically higher. Does everybody see that a bachelor's degree here has almost double the weekly salary that somebody has just a high school diploma? But you know what's really interesting in this country? Does everybody know what percentage of people actually don't get a high school diploma? It's almost 20% of our population still in 2018, which is remarkable. So it shouldn't surprise us that who do we think is really unemployed? Now this says 7.4%, but I'm telling you it's actually much worse than that. So here we'll get to the ugly truth, because there is some ugliness here. When we think about unemployment, there should be a really easy definition. Like if we have 100 people in our workforce and 5% are looking for, 5 people are looking for jobs, it should be a 5% rate, right? That seems pretty clean. But interestingly, if 6 months later, 3 of the 5 people are still looking for work, but 2 just sort of drop out and say, I'm not looking for work anymore, according to our official statistics, actually the labor pool has dropped from 100 to 98, and we only have 3 people looking for it. And guess what? Unemployment has remarkably gone down. Because those 2 people who left, these what we call the discouraged workers, are no longer in the official workforce. It means a decrease in what we call the labor participation rate. And the funny thing is, that's the main definition that I gave you is what we call U3, which is this green line here. Actually, our labor statistics, we use 6 official definitions for unemployment, and the one that I always keep track of is this orange one, U6, which includes all those discouraged workers who aren't looking for jobs anymore. And I hope everybody can see that that's several percentage points higher. In fact, it had grown to more than 16% just after the Great Recession started, around 2010 it peaked. And you see it comes down, but again, this is misleading because I'm going to show you some more very ugly statistics. First of all, we can also look at the participation rate. Remember we talked about it tied to education. Notice now, if you have high school or less, actually we have only 84% of the population in the labor force. A lot of those people have just exited. Notice that people with a bachelor's degree or higher, only 4% are kind of not in the workforce. And so it's clear from this, you can see that the more education you have, the better you've been able to kind of survive the tougher times in the labor market. But there's other ugly truths that we need to look at. I don't know if people know that in the country right now, we're spending an enormous amount on disability. In fact, there are about 14 million Americans in the country who are getting disability checks every month, basically not to work. Now, there's been a big increase just in the last decade or so. A lot of that is legitimate. It's tied to the armed forces and everybody who's served in the Middle East and in these invasions, and they come back and they actually can't enter the workforce for a variety of reasons. But folks, 14 million people is like 8 to 10% of our workforce. And the fact that I'm on Wall Street and we bicker over whether the employment rate's going to be 4.1% or 4.2%, when we've got literally millions of people and hundreds of percentage or basis points of Americans that we don't even count. They're just out of the workforce completely. And interestingly, as I said, that what some people are suggesting is a lot of this disability is really just become permanent unemployment benefits. Because you'll see in orange is the disability application and blue is unemployment. And when unemployment spikes, you'll notice also that disability kind of oddly spikes too. They're highly correlated. And keep in mind that we've gotten rid of a lot of welfare benefits over the last 25 years. It started during the Clinton administration. So a lot of people sort of just basically, if they're overweight, if they have diabetes, they can get letters from their doctors and basically claim some disability. I'm not saying that everybody is trying to cheat the system, but there's a kind of an odd correlation between what's going on in disability relative to labor conditions. And I'm not even talking now about the fact that we've also begun to criminalize a large percentage of our population. If you think of it this way, in 1980, we had only about 320,000 in prison, 182,000 in jail, about 1.1 million on probation. Look at these numbers by 2015. 1.5 billion in prison, 728,000 in jail, and over 3.8 million people on probation. Now, generally speaking, like, it's probably because the labor market's not that good, right? Most people who, if there were good jobs out there, I'm not sure all these people would have turned to crime. But this is, again, millions of people who are not even in the labor force, not counted in official statistics. But this is not a good story. And of course, it's left us, interestingly, when we see these education gaps and income gaps, is you can sort of see that often in areas that are not that far from each other. So here's, let's say, look in Metro LA. You can be in Orange County. Anybody here live in the OC? 87.6 years, which is maybe 9 years longer than the average in the US.
Wow.
More people have bachelors than don't, and you see per capita income. If we went to Compton Watts, notice that life expectancy is about 15 years less. Virtually no one has a bachelor's degree. Income is like about a third. And I of course picked a dramatic place like LA, but where I live up in New York, the Bronx, we have 23,400 as the median income. Westchester is almost 71,000. And I went and looked here over in Everett, where there's a Target over there. I used to do some shopping. It's 24,240, but was Wellesley just a couple of towns over, right? This exists everywhere in America, where we really are living in a country of countries. I show you the 72.8 years life expectancy. That's what, like, Egypt's life expectancy is, and they're like ranked 95th of the world or something. So, this story is not perfect. There's definitely certain people who have been left behind, and a lot of it is clearly tied to education. And the funny thing is, interestingly, labor costs just keep going up and up and up, and we see that the price of things like robots just keep going down. And this is a recent McKinsey story. I mean, keep in mind that we're not the only country facing this robot future. You've got Japan, Germany, also expecting to see like about a quarter of jobs. This is just by 2030 that can somehow be replaced by some form of automation. But even China and India are now worrying about it, because a lot of their jobs too can be mechanized away. And some people like Jon Burmeister and I were having lunch, and we talked about, like, well, does anybody remember WALL-E, that movie? We kept thinking, like, is this going to be the future where robots do all the work and we're just these kind of like blobs floating around with iPads communicating with each other, being like kind of unhealthy, not too smart? If I remember, they were not that smart. And I don't know. I don't think it's going to be that kind of a future. But of course, when you look at a lot of this data, you certainly do worry that that could be the end. But I think the future, I'm a little bit more optimistic. My wife found this quote: "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." Eleanor Roosevelt. I liked Napoleon Dynamite. I think he said, "Follow your dreams, Pedro. That's what I do." And I sort of believe that really, the future could be more beautiful than we think. Nobody even knows Yogi Berra anymore, but Yogi Berra said, "The future ain't what it used to be." And I think it's really true. And you have to remember in history that we do have a great history of adapting. And the arc of history really is largely positive. And college really has been the key to success. Certainly the data shows more learning has meant more earning. But if you think about what you're going to do in the future, it's a little different than the last 1 or 2 generations, where you trained for a job or a career, and you probably were going to do that one thing for your whole life. But most of us here are going to probably live to 100, and we might actually have multiple jobs over much longer stretches of our lives. So, you have to ask yourself, how are we supposed to prepare for this future that we kind of can't even imagine what jobs are going to be out there? Now, some stuff I think we can imagine. Think about people working with machines and robots, right? That's probably, we can get an idea. I mentioned the combine. That's a good example of a guy gets on this machine and now can do a lot more. It doesn't work by itself. You still need people to kind of operate it. Has anybody seen this robot bricklayer? It actually can lay about 5 times as many bricks as an average human can do in an hour, but you do need some human beings to help kind of do some finish work. But you certainly can boost productivity dramatically the same way the farmer can with a combine. Of course, we know like drones still need people to operate them, and whether they're dropping bombs or dropping Amazon packages, right? People probably are still going to sort of work with robots and automated machines. My daughter is actually heading to medical school, and I told you got to be careful because there actually are people doing remote surgery now. There is some robotic surgery, and we might need less surgeons out there. This is actually true in certain small instances. People can be operated on using robots. But the best example, I think, of what you should think about the optimistic future with robots is, anybody here play chess? Now, a computer beat a human playing chess, I think, about 20 years ago. It was Deep Blue had beaten Garry Kasparov. But interestingly, you'd think like nobody would play chess anymore. Why, when computers can beat you? And the answer is actually now that a human with a computer can actually beat the computer. And actually, there's a big cult, subcult, I don't know what you would call it, of chess players who actually, it's like a team of people with a team of computers plays another team of computers and people. And that's actually very competitive right now. And so I think we have to think of the future like that in some respects. There'll be lots of jobs where we're going to just have to kind of work with other people and computers, but they'll be much more of a regular part of our lives. And this really brings us to the liberal arts, because some people might say, well, should I just study computer engineering and coding and things like that? But interestingly, Aram and Araska did a study in 2011. Their book's called Academically Adrift. And they noticed that few American students are actually improving cognitively and learning to learn during college. And that's because right now 40% of US undergraduates major in either business or management subjects. And few bachelor's programs really require enough reading, writing, discourse needed to develop critical thinking skills. Which majors do you think do develop these skills? Liberal arts majors. Liberal arts majors do this. Keep in mind that in management and business classes, textbooks and short articles, most kids don't even have to read really big, thick books, and probably the longest paper they'll write is maybe 3 pages. How many of you have to write papers more than 10 pages? Anybody have to do more like a 25-page paper or theses? Well, when you get to grad school, maybe. But more than likely, if you're doing liberal arts, you're probably reading text more and you're writing more. And the social skills formed in Aram Araska's study tended to center around extracurriculars with little connection to cognitive development and collaborative problem solving. And they said that if you study liberal arts, chances are you were getting much more of that. In fact, liberal arts majors really are fulfilling most of what experts are telling us help us develop cognitively what we need for the future. The multidisciplinary training in multiple subjects, basically teaching us how to learn, learning to learn, because really you will probably have to learn new things over the next 50, 60, 70 years of your life if you want to stay in the workforce. Which kind of brings us back to the liberal arts renaissance, and we have to ask ourselves, is the trivium and quadrivium, which is really the basis of the liberal arts, which is a couple of thousand years old, this idea of grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, they were called the artes liberales, and these were the subjects that the Greeks thought were essential for what a person needed to know to participate in civic life. And I think one of our speakers was going to talk about Aristotle, but you'll see in the middle it says philosophy, because I think Aristotle really considered all of this kind of, quote, philosophy. It's kind of what we need to appreciate leisure and what he called the good life. And interestingly, too, when you ask experts, technologists and education professionals, what are the most valuable skills in the future, You know, the ones that they talk about are those that machines cannot easily replicate, like creativity, critical thinking, emotional intelligence, adaptability, and collaboration. And actually, this is what employers want. In this 2016 survey that I looked at, 80.1% said they sought candidates with good leadership skills, 78.9 want graduates with the ability to work in a team, 70.2 need employees with good written communication skills, 70.2 look for workers with good problem-solving skills, 68.9 prioritize employees with excellent oral communication skills. Ability to just sort of speak intelligently. And this is what we develop in the liberal arts. And I studied liberal arts for about 4 years by interviewing foreign students. How many of you students are not from the US? Well, interestingly, I surveyed about 1,200, and the two most cited reasons in my surveys that students came to the US were, one said, I wanted to experience new ways of thinking, studying, or learning, and the second was I wanted a broader, more flexible curriculum than one offered in my home country. And the truth is that if you go outside of the US, nothing looks like our liberal arts system where you take little bits of a lot of different courses. If you go to Oxford or Cambridge and you study history, all you're going to study for 3 years is history. You're not going to read Shakespeare. You're not going to go into a bio lab. You're not going to have a math class. That's one of the things, the reasons that we now have 1 million international students here in this country, is to kind of get that broader education. We actually have almost 350,000 just coming for undergraduate degrees. What else does the liberal arts foster? Well, Deichweiler has a study in 2016 where he surveyed 1,000 graduates who were between 10 and 40 years after graduation. And what he noted was that there was a high relationship between a broad undergraduate education in liberal arts and financial success. Those with more than half of their courses and subjects unrelated to their majors were 31 to 72% more likely than others to have higher level positions and to be earning more than $100,000. And the quote from the survey was, to succeed in a world that awaits them, college graduates will have to apply novel theories and think across disciplines in order to tackle the challenges of the 21st century. They'll have to think differently and challenge the status quo. Keen observation, full of new possibilities and surprising connections will be their key to success. And again, I think that's really what you get in the liberal arts. Even the Shark Tank host, Mark Cuban, talks about how he doesn't think going forward, even like coding and computer skills are that important, because you're going to have computers doing that. What you really need is free thinkers who can look at the data and make some sense of it. And a former Google, Microsoft executive who's an expert in AI said, given AI is more objective, analytical, and data-driven, maybe it's time for some of us to switch to the humanities, liberal arts, and beauty. Because he said that the greatest thing we can do with all this technology is to try to figure out how to solve problems. And you know, I always do one of these speeches, and I use this quote all the time. Alan Gregg, who said, the human race has long had a long experience and a fine tradition in surviving adversity. But we now face a task for which we have little experience, the task of surviving prosperity. And I really think that that sort of echoes a lot of Aristotle's themes about we have to think of the world as not a world of work anymore, because we're going to start working less and less and less. You know, it's not about surviving, right? It's really about thriving. In fact, Jon and I, when we were talking a little bit about it, we said really, humans have now sort of conquered Maslow's, at least the bottom of the pyramid of human needs. We don't have to worry that much about health and food, and safety is becoming less important. We should be focusing more on these higher level needs. And again, that's certainly something that Aristotle talked about. And the funny thing is, we're going to have more and more time to cultivate this. You know, as our life expectancy stretches out, and work actually starts to be less and less, we'll start having shorter work weeks, at least that's the projection, and people may even retire a little earlier. What you find actually is that we're going to get to the point by 2040 where maybe all we spend is about 20% or 25% of our lifetime working. And we'll be having like maybe 75% or 80% working on leisure. And working on leisure is something that is really important. Thinking about how to use this leisure time productively. Because actually, when you look at Americans and how we spend our couple of hours of free day that we have right now, does everybody see? Most of us are still watching television, really. Socializing and communicating is only like a quarter of that. We just haven't figured out yet how to use all this time. It's time affluence, I think, is a great expression I've heard. We haven't figured out how necessarily to use it wisely. And interestingly, there's a whole new realm of science theories, of science of happiness that's coming out, trying to figure more about how can we become happier, particularly if we have all this extra time. And it's being taught at some of the best universities in the country, at UPenn, Berkeley, Yale. And what these courses are trying to do is train our minds to really pursue happiness. And a lot of it does center around the liberal arts. And this line I took from one of the speeches was about delayed gratification in our age of abundance, teaching ourselves to sort of think in much longer time periods as we become more time affluent. But if I ask most of you if you feel time affluent, most of you probably say, I don't have time to do anything. We all feel just unbelievably hurried. And that's why I think it's interesting that mindfulness, you hear that expression, is coming in vogue. There are actually now degrees in mindfulness where we can learn actually how to take better advantage of time, be more in the present, really trying to thrive and enjoy all this prosperity that we have as humans. And one of the interesting things that's come out of the science of happiness is how important altruism is to making people happy. It's really funny, but helping other people, making other people happy actually makes us happy. And actually you kind of have to train yourself to think that way. I can go on here with more data on what else liberal arts and the pursuit of happiness, how they're all connected. Deitweiler mentions that graduates who discuss philosophy or ethical issues in classes, and he took a lot of classes in humanities, were 25 to 60% more likely than others to have characteristics of altruists. They volunteered more, they gave more to nonprofit groups. Students with professors who encouraged them to examine strengths and weaknesses of one's views, and whose courses emphasize questions on which there is not necessarily a correct answer, were 25 to 40% more likely to report that they felt personally fulfilled. Graduates who reported they took a large role in class discussions were 27 to 38% more likely to report characteristics of lifelong learners, and students who reported their classwork was professionally oriented were less likely to become lifelong learners. All of this giving you sort of building the case as to why you should study liberal arts. And of course, keep in mind that in the future, there are loads of jobs that still we need to do as humans. There's poverty that still needs to come down. There are diseases that need to be cured. There's climate change. There's sexism, racism, classism, inequality. We still have many civil wars going on in the world. And the funny thing is that algorithms and computer coding can't necessarily solve all these problems, right? That's what the liberal arts are for. And that's why the beautiful future really is about learning to use our time better. I think that, I don't know if leisure is a verb, but I like it. To leisure better. We all need to learn to leisure better. And hopefully liberal arts can help not only with employment and happiness, hopefully helping us to learn how to thrive in the future or just survive. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes for questions.
How many are liberal arts majors out there? Anybody here from the Carroll School of Management? Maybe we'll get you to transfer. Yes?
How do you account for the discrepancy between the statistical evidence that we should be happy and then the self-reporting which falls below that?
Well, I think one of the things we also learn from the science of happiness is we often judge ourselves not by our absolute sense of well-being, but our relative sense of well-being. And of course, when you have social media and everybody looks like they're having a fabulous time with probably airbrushed pictures and fake stories about all the fun they're having, it makes us all feel like we're not at the party and we're not really enjoying what we should be. It's like other people are doing better than us. So I think there's a little bit of that, and maybe this social media sort of emphasizes that, makes us feel worse. Yes?
Is there any thing to be said for a tradition that emphasizes the dignity of work?
Well, you know, that's such a great question, because I use that term all the time, the dignity of work. I mean, I think work, there is dignity and there's a nobility sort of in work and toil. But I think we shouldn't overemphasize it relative to if we had time for leisure, right? I think in how many of us wind up actually doing at work what we love to do? A lot of us probably don't even know what we love to do. We haven't given ourselves enough time to really understand that. I know I have kids and I ask them all the time, are you really taking the courses that you want to take, that you're really legitimately interested in? Or are you just doing it because you think it's going to help you with work, or you think it looks good on your record, or whatever? And I think like we now really do need to take time to really think like what is it that we really want to do. I think understanding our own individual desires is a really tough thing to do in this world of social media where we're looking left and right and looking at what everybody else is doing. It's really tough to just turn it all off and try to figure out what you want to do for yourself. Maybe it is work, and there is dignity and nobility in it, but I also think there's maybe greater dignity and nobility in leisure. Yes.
So what the statistics about kind of correlating success and happiness and things like that with liberal arts education, concern about that is that liberal arts education is, in a lot of cases, more available to affluent people than to people who aren't. So people who go to community college, people who go to, state universities now, state legislatures are trying to cut liberal arts degrees. So there's a kind of inequity in who has access to this.
You're
benefit.
totally right, and I only gave you all the educational data. I could have given you racial and ethnic data and broken it down, because clearly there is going to be certain biases in all of this. You're absolutely right. But it's unfortunate that we think of getting a degree in English or history as something that only affluent people can obtain.
Afford to do.
We think of that, but the reality is, over the long run, actually those are the better degrees. It's just unfortunate that we do have a system that wants immediate, data. Don't we have scorecards now on like what's the return on investment to employment? Somewhere down the road, higher ed has gotten intertwined with employment. It wasn't developed for employment, was it? It really was developed, for educational purposes, for life. It wasn't really geared towards employment. That's just something that's happened maybe in the last 2 generations, is universities and higher ed has been hijacked by people who feel like, well, we should be using it to produce a labor force, a workforce.
I mean, my students take out a lot of loans to get through school, and their parents sometimes take out loans, and the all-in cost of a private, 4-year college liberal arts degree is probably $300,000, and they aren't wealthy. So when they get out of school with that English degree or whatever, they need to get a job, and they need to earn, and they need to service these loans, and they want to do other things and take on other projects in their lives that will cost money, like start families and stuff. So they're very anxious about the world of work, and their perception, and my students' perception, is that an economics degree has more value. That the bankers are more likely to hire them, the consulting firms are more likely to hire them, and that they're just it's a safer bet. Now, some of them just love reading Milton, and by golly, they're going to major in English whether it's prudent or not. But they worry that it's not prudent, and I just wonder, why isn't the market, if this sort of critical thinking really is of value, why isn't the market signaling that in a really evident way to them?
I think in the short run, what we're talking about are the equivalent of like farm hands 150 years ago. And now with services being really what the country produces, right? We're about 70% services compared to agriculture, which is less than 1%, and manufacturing, I think, is less than 20% now, 20-something percent. So the truth is that all of these sort of like MBAs or undergraduates in econ majors are sort of like the farm hands of the day. They're the factory workers of our day. Our factory workers are now, our factories are banks and law firms and consulting firms. But interestingly, a lot of this work is going to kind of go away and evolve. There's a lot of that work now that can be done by artificial intelligence and people are really human software in a lot of situations. So I think that yes, we've got data that would say you're better off getting your BA. I mean, I showed you the data, right, that says you got to go to college and you got to get these degrees. But I think the question is really, like, do you want to be getting your degree only in economics or meaning like that might be good for now, but where is it going to take you in 50 years, you know? And I'm just not sure an econ degree doesn't just sort of like pigeonhole you. And who knows, it could be that you know, the bankers of today are the equivalent of like assembly line workers in 20 or 30 years when a variety of software programs come in and sort of get rid of people. I mean, I'm in asset management. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of what ETFs are, these exchange-traded funds. And basically what they are is robo-fund managers. And basically they replace, you know, large teams of researchers and portfolio managers, and they've got algorithms that kind of define what they invest in. And so we're already beginning to see a little of that. So, you know, I understand the tension of having to pay for your 4-year degree. Although, you know, some people would argue that you don't even need to, what did Matt Damon say in Good Will Hunting? You just spent $200,000 on a degree that you could have gotten with 50 cents in overdue fines at the local library, right? Yeah. You know, you could do self-education. The ability to educate yourself or to learn coding and to learn a lot of the technical skills for jobs. I mean, people are saying that you may actually, to get a job, better off just getting a badge or going to a community college and getting a kind of a certificate of some sort of badge that allows you to work. But if you're going to really invest 4 years, like, wouldn't you want to be cultivating your mind for like the next 50 years of employment? And that to me seems like we have to gear ourselves up. I mean, I myself went back to school in my 40s to get degrees. You know, you have to sort of think in the long run. And it's hard when in the last couple of generations we're still in this mindset of you go to college to study for a job. But, you know, it might be different in the future. We have to sort of at least consider the possibility.
Let's thank Peter for his talk.
Yeah. What did you go back to school for?
I went back.